Yep. All right. I see. Yeah, me on Twitch. Sweet. All right. Can everybody hear me? Maybe. Yes. All right, cool. All right, my name is Adam Driscoll, and today we're going to be talking about automating your web browser with PowerShell and Selenium. So I'm going to get into Selenium a little bit first, and then I'm going to talk about how to actually integrate that with Pester. So the actual Pester side of things is actually pretty straightforward, but the Selenium side is a little more interesting. So that's where we're going to start there. And yeah, so a little bit about me. That's me drinking a giant beer. I'm also drinking one now too. I am a developer. I've made lots of stuff that you might be familiar with. PowerShell tools for Visual Studio, Universal Dashboard, which we're looking at right now. I'm actually going to give away a free premium license at the end of this. So if you stick around, we're going to run a PowerShell script to do that. PowerShell Pro tools I've made, PS ScriptPad, Posh Internals is one of my older ones, and Universal Automation is my newest baby. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been around for a while. I own a tiny little software company called Iron Man Software, where I've kind of built some of this stuff now and sell some of it. I'm a two-time Ironman finisher. That's me looking very tired. And I got married this last year. We're almost 1 year in. That's my wife with a squirrel. And we recently became a dog dad. So that is my dog dad, or my dog Austin. He's a social media influencer. He even has his own blog. All right, so enough about me. Let's talk a little bit about Selenium. So I'm going to pop over to this slide. So we're going to be talking about Selenium today. And so what is Selenium? Selenium is actually a pretty well-known and kind of highly used platform for automating web browsers. It's been around for a long time, and pretty much you'll find lots of PowerShell scripts that actually utilize Selenium, just because they offer .NET integration. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, is a Selenium WebDriver that allows you to actually automate your browser via C#. They also have things like the Selenium IDE, where you can actually install a Firefox or Chrome add-in and record what's going on, as well as Selenium Grid, which allows you to fan out your automation so that you can run multiple tests at once across multiple computers and that kind of thing. So it's a pretty robust system. But what we're going to mostly be looking at today is a wrapper around the C# WebDriver. So the WebDriver is just a C# library that pretty much interfaces over the top of the various different native drivers for the different browsers like Chrome, Firefox, pretty much anything you can think of. And as you can see here, so this code is pretty C#-esque. The idea being that you kind of create a new driver which will open a web browser. You can then navigate that web browser, find elements in the page, wait for things to happen, and then interact with the web browser itself. So what I did as part of the Universal Dashboard project was that I actually created a PowerShell wrapper around that C# WebDriver. So there's been some other users that have contributed a lot to this this particular project now. And the idea here is that we just have some cool PowerShell commandlets that you can use then that invoke the the C# WebDriver underneath the covers. So this is the actual cross-platform PowerShell module. It supports Windows, Linux, and Mac because of PowerShell Core. And yeah, you should be able to automate your browser on any platform. And the primary reason I built this was for Universal Dashboard. Oh, this happened before. I don't know why this is for Universal Dashboard. And I will show some tests on how we're doing this, but pretty much Universal Dashboard is a web framework for PowerShell, and we use Selenium to test a lot of the functionality. All right, so I'm going to be popping in between this console, the browser, and VS Code for this session. So we are going to step to our next little section here. And what I'm actually going to show you how to do is find elements using Selenium. So one of the, I'd say the things you'll do the most when using the Selenium module is actually finding elements on the page to interact with. It's not super straightforward. That's why things like the Selenium IDE exist, so that you can kind of record those steps. But I will show you how to do this kind of natively. So what I have here is a universal dashboard website that's running with the various pages that I've created. And we're going to actually use Selenium to inspect elements, interact with elements on the page here, and then kind of go from there. So this first page that I have, it has several elements on it. We have a div tag, or I'd say 4 div tags. And you can see that I'm setting various attributes and content for these div tags. So this first div tag here is just a hello world div. A div is just an HTML tag that is typically used to, is like a container for things inside the page. And I'm providing an ID. So if we pop over to the browser, the easiest way to actually determine that particular component's information is by right-clicking on it and clicking Inspect Element. So that'll bring up the browser's dev tools down here, and it'll actually highlight that element right here. So you can see here's the div that was created. Universal Dashboard uses like React, which is Facebook's JavaScript library for building UIs. And it does a bunch of JavaScript, but in the end, it outputs an HTML page like this. So you can see here that in the HTML, I have this div tag that has an ID of my element with the content of hello world. So the easiest way to find an element inside of a website is by ID. IDs are supposed to be unique throughout a page. So in this case, the ID of my element should be unique, and I should be able to just quickly find that element using the find element or se element command. So let me pop down to kind of the examples that I'm using here. So the first one is using find se element, and I'm passing in the driver. So the driver itself is the WebDriver, which would, particularly be like a Firefox WebDriver, the Chrome WebDriver, the IE WebDriver, and you just pass that driver in, and then you can automate or you can utilize the features of that driver to automate the browser. There are kind of 2 different ways that you can use the Selenium PowerShell module. This way is kind of passing the driver to every single commandlet, which can, obviously it looks like it's, it's a lot of typing to actually pass it into each one. You can also set a default driver when you start up the PowerShell script, so then it'll always use that default driver and you don't have to pass it in. In this example, I'm just being really declarative and saying that like I'm using this driver for each one of these commandlets, but you could, set the default driver if you wanted to. So in this example, I'm actually finding that element by the ID. So that's the easiest way to find elements. And what you'll see here is it'll find that element, and I should have that element available inside my variable here. So this element here is a remote web element. So it's actually a Selenium object. So this comes from the Selenium WebDriver C# library. You can see it has a bunch of different methods. So this is kind of the stuff that we've wrapped inside PowerShell commandlets. So there's nothing stopping you from just calling this stuff directly. And there's lots of PowerShell scripts out there that do this kind of stuff. Things like clicking, finding sub-elements, getting attributes and CSS values. I'll show you some examples of that. Certain browsers support getting screenshots, that kind of thing. You can even get like the pixel locations on the page, that kind of thing. All right, so now that we have an element, I'm going to show you a couple different other ways that you can find elements on the page, since this is a pretty common use case for this module. Another way to find elements is by class name. So if we pop over to this browser again and we look at this second element, you'll see that the second element doesn't have an ID that's really easy to find. So this ID is a GUID. It's generated every time this dashboard starts up. There's no good way to find this element besides some other identifying aspect of that element. So you'll find that with lots of websites, that can be the case. They definitely aren't going to have IDs on every single control. So in this case, we can use something like the class name. So a class name is a CSS cascading style sheet class, which applies typically these styles that you see in this middle column here. And a lot of times you can use that as an identifier for different HTML elements because they might apply very specific class names to particular components. So like, for example, this header up here, which is actually part of the Material UI JavaScript library, has a bunch of very specific class names on it that you could probably use to identify a header within this type web page. So to find a class name, you're just going to use something as simple as find SE element, specify a class name, and continue from there. All right, so now we have our second element that we found via class name. And finally, I want to show a little more of a complex example where this is actually kind of good for performance reasons as well. We have an element here that is called child, and child is a div within a div. So the child div doesn't have a well-known ID. It has no class name. All it has is some content that we might be trying to like validate rather than locate. But the parent has an ID. So one thing you can do is you can actually search for the parent component and then search for child components of that parent component later. So in this example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find that parent component by ID, and then I'm going to print the ID out using getSEElement attribute. And then I'm going to find the child element relative to the parent element. So rather than passing in driver as the target, I'm actually passing an element. So what that does is it actually will search the children of the parent rather than the entire document. Every time you put in the driver as the target, then it searches the entire document. And that can be slow depending on how large the document is and that kind of thing. But it also gives you another avenue to find elements that may not have identifying characteristics. So if we hit C, you can see we got the parent element, and that was out. I don't know why this is output there, but we have the parent element, which is output right there, which is that ID. And then if I step one more time, you'll see that it output that GUID of that child element. So that's the ID of the element we just selected. So if we look at that guy, you can see that we have that information for the child element. So some other things that are supported by this commandlet are things like searching by XPath and CSS selectors, that kind of thing. So you can get really fancy in the way that you actually select elements within the page. All right, so let's actually move on to our next topic at hand. I'm using enter SE URL. That's how you move different pages within the browser. You can see I'm just putting in the URL of the page that I want to locate. And now we're on the next page. So this page is made up of a value div, I think. Oh, it's actually a paragraph tag, text box, and then a button. So what I want to show you is to get different features of a particular element. So you've kind of seen this already, as you can get the text of an element. So a lot of times this is what I'll use for validation, to validate that, you know, a button was updated, a text box has the correct text, control is rendered, that kind of thing. So if I hit C here, you'll see that this is some cool text. Wait, I'm ahead of myself a little. Value was the example that I just was talking about. I forgot to put a weight debugger here. But value came from this sum text element, which was actually this one right here. So that returned the actual text value that's stored within inside this paragraph tag. So one thing to note with text properties is they return all their children's text as well. So if you had a bunch of nested stuff, and like if I got like the body text, it would return all the children's text. So you'd see all kinds of text. So sometimes that's all you need to validate something, is just searching that parent's text to find whether or not the child has some text. All right, so the next example that I was going to show that I already ran was getting attribute values. So an attribute is just, it's very much like an XML attribute in HTML, and you can just get the value of those attributes by piping elements to get ST element attribute. And if we look at this particular control, you'll see it's an input control, and then it has this value attribute here, and that's the actual attribute that we're grabbing. So you can see here that I just pipe that there, and out in my console, I have printed out, this is some cool text. So that actually got that attribute value from that HTML element. So this is something that you could typically do with, XML parser or anything like that to actually get the static values out of that HTML document. Another cool thing that you can do, which is probably one of my favorite features, is the ability to get calculated CSS values. So we have this button neat control here. Whoop. And you can see this button has a bunch of styles applied to it. And you can see it's got some rounding, some box shadow on it. The text is a certain format and that kind of thing. And in the center column, you'll see that we have a bunch of different CSS styles applied to it. So a lot of these styles are coming from different places. You can see that we have lots of inline styles that get applied via the Material UI theme library, that kind of thing. And what you'll notice is that these styles, like some of them are crossed out. That means that they are overridden by styles that come later. So for example, this tried to apply a background color that's transparent. But then if you scroll up, you'll see that a background color of this particular hex value is applied instead later on. And what that results in is this actual computed value of the CSS control or CSS values for this particular button. And that's what the button actually looks like. So even though all these styles are applied, these are the styles that are actually effective on that button. So what you can use is the get CSS value method. I don't know. I think there's a commandlet for this, but I don't know why it's not in this demo. But it more or less allows you to get that computed CSS value for that element. So I'm going to be looking up the box shadow. And if we go into Firefox, you'll see that the box shadow is this long string of colors and sizes. So it kind of specifies the size of the box shadow and rounding of the box shadow and that kind of thing. And if I just run that code in PowerShell, you'll see that it'll output that actual string as the same one that is inside Firefox. So that allows you to, actually see if styles are applied. I use this for making sure colors get applied, font sizes get applied, that kind of thing. So yeah. All right. Next, I want to talk a little bit about interaction, because interaction is kind of the biggest thing that you're going to do with a framework such as this. Wait, what did I just do? Neat, clickable. Oh, yeah. No, that's okay. We're on the interaction page. So I have a couple different buttons. I have a button up here. I have a text box, and I have another button called Wait for Me. I'll just show you what those buttons do. So up in our Universal Dashboard website, the first button, just you click it, and it's going to show a toast box that just pops up a message to the end user. In this case, I'm going to say hello. And then we have a text box. It doesn't do anything. You can enter some text into it. And finally, I have a button that you can click. And when you click it, it's going to wait 3 seconds, and then it's going to add a new element to the page. So it's actually going to add a new image to this parent element here. So I'll talk a little bit about why that's important and kind of what that means for Selenium. So first of all, what we're going to do is we're actually going to click that first button. So what you can do with Selenium is, use find SE element as you would with any other element. And then you're going to pipe that over to invoke SE click. So what that's going to do is it will actually invoke a click in the browser. So that actually mimics a user clicking the actual button. So unlike using a JavaScript click, which I'll talk about in a second, it actually is like the user clicking the button rather than like running some JavaScript to click the button, more or less. And as you can see, it toasted a little hello in the top right there. And if we do that, we could do it a bunch of times. So, click the button a bunch of times. All right. The other thing that we can do is we can send text to different elements on the page. So in this case, I'm doing a pretty standard thing that you would expect. I'm sending text to a text box. So you can use send SE keys to send keys to an element. So for a text box, what that pretty much results in is just the text box filling up with text. So you can see there's a text that I sent to my text box. And back in my PowerShell console, you'll see that, oops, that I got the text back out using get SE element again. So it actually updated that attribute value inside the HTML DOM after I typed that text in there. And I can get that value back out to ensure that that text got typed in there more or less. You can also send keys to other elements that don't typically you'd expect to like take a key. So for example, like the body element or the root element of an HTML page. And where this is important is for like accessibility testing, because you can send special keys to this send SE keys commandlet. It supports keys like tab and enter and then modifier keys and that kind of thing. So if you wanted to actually like tab through your website, enter text without ever having to do like invoke SE click, you could do that. So that's cool for testing like accessibility to make sure that your forms actually have the correct tab index on them and that kind of thing. So yeah, just keep in mind that you can send more than just text keys. You can also send other special keys. All right, and finally, I want to show an example of what happens when you click something and it takes a while for something to happen. So when I first started working on Universal Dashboard, I had a lot of this going on. You know, I'd have something like, I want to click this element, and then I'm going to wait 5 seconds for something to happen, and then I'm going to find that element to make sure it happened. What I didn't realize was that Selenium actually has what's called an implicit weight built into it. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to click this, and this avatar is not going to like exist right away, because if you recall that script block that we were looking at up here waits 3 seconds before it actually will add that avatar ID. So that means that it's not going to exist on the page. But because of the implicit wait, which I've set actually at the top here, to 30 seconds, it'll wait up to 30 seconds for that element to appear before it throws an exception. Or actually, I think it returns null. And then that means you don't have to have all that stuff in there to like try to time this web browser correctly. You can just rely on the Selenium WebDriver to take care of that for you. So I'm going to click this button, and then it's going to find that element, and you'll see that the script itself will just wait. So let's actually open this. And this is really important for testing, especially when you start putting your tests on like a Azure DevOps agent that's a lot slower than your desktop PC. You can see it clicks it, and now it waits for 3 seconds, and eventually you'll see that the image appears. And now in the console, you can see it's gone back to the console. It's no longer waiting, because immediately as that thing appears, fortunately, it looks like it's actually empty for some reason. Immediately as that thing appears, it will return from that find SE element call right here. Oh, I didn't store it in a variable, that's why. So yeah, so that's kind of what you want to do with your tests, is rely on that implicit wait, because Selenium will return immediately as that particular element appears, rather than you having to like mess with putting all this timing into your tests. All right, so I want to talk about a couple gotchas. Go to the next page. All right, so the first one is, you can see that I popped up this modal. So the modal is on top of everything. I use something called a ZIndex to like position it over the top of the entire website, and then kind of puts this like gray div over the top of the entire document. So what you're going to notice is that I have another button that's underneath there. So you see this button click? That is this other click me button that is hidden underneath this modal. And because of that, what's going to happen when I try to actually click that button, it's going to fail. And you're going to see this weird error. You're going to see this weird error that says this element was obscured by this other element, and it's not in a clickable position. And that's very true, because this is supposed to interact with the website as a user would interact, and they can't click on that button. So that it's like giving you that that exception for a reason. So this can be kind of sticky depending on the framework that you're using or what you're trying to click and that kind of thing. You might not care if an actual user could click it. So one way to work around that is to actually use the JavaScript Click switch on Invoke SE Click. So how I was talking about this before, where there's like, the Invoke SE Click is trying to behave as a user, and there's another way to click with JavaScript. Well, this is how you do that. It will actually run some JavaScript code to click that button, even though it's obscured by another control. So if I just continue here, you'll see that, oh, that was a bad example because I didn't have the web browser up. 1 sec. I'll just run that again. And you should see it will click that button and pop a toast. So it actually clicks that button using JavaScript rather than using the actual like user API. So it's one way to kind of work around that particular scenario. One other problem that you have to really be aware of is like if you set your implicit weight really high and you use find SE element without adjusting that, it's going to make your tests take really long if things fail. So this is like constantly a problem I have. You got to kind of put some like proper error handling into your tests. For example, if the page doesn't load at all, which I'll show you an example of in a little bit, it will, it'll cause all the tests to cascade and fail. But what really should happen is like you should have a test at the beginning just to validate that the page showed up, so that it doesn't take like an hour to make it through your entire test suite. Because what you're going to say here is that now that this implicit weight is set and this element does not exist, then it's just going to wait 30 seconds. So once that finally finishes, you'll see an exception pop up. But then we're going to finish this presentation with, or this part of the presentation with stop SE driver, which will actually terminate the web browser. So that will actually clean up the web browser, and then you can kind of finish your test. And you can see it went away. And you can see find SE element actually just returns null. It doesn't actually throw an exception, just so you know. All right, so, and that's another reason to like, when you're testing for negative, like, does this element not exist, can really extend your test times because, yeah. All right, so I want to show off what I'm doing for Universal Dashboard, kind of where I came from and where I'm going with the testing for it, just so you have like a better idea. All this stuff is open source and up on GitHub, so you can see all these tests if you want to check it out later. And I'll show you how we used to do it and how we're doing it now. So previously, what I was doing, this is actually even improved from how it used to be, but pretty much what I was doing before was I was starting a new dashboard. So every time you do this, it starts up a new web server. So the idea was that you would have a dashboard, and then you could like configure that dashboard with the contents that you need, and then you could validate that dashboard. Then you'd enter the URL to go to the page. You'd run the Selenium commands, that kind of thing. The other thing is it like imports this test framework, which that was responsible for importing Selenium, starting up the driver, that kind of thing, and then it would tear it down after the test. So every single test, it would start the browser, it would start a web server multiple times, and then it would tear down the browser. In the very beginning, I was actually starting the browser for every single test because I had this like, desire to make every test as like standalone as possible and that kind of thing. But with these long-running automation tests, it like was becoming really cumbersome because a universal dashboard test execution could take about 40 minutes. And I'll actually run an entire test execution for a large suite of the tests during this presentation, just so you can see the difference. Yeah, so now you can see that it's somewhat improved, but it's still not quite great in this particular scenario. But what we've moved to now is we're we're actually building our tests a little bit smarter, and they're less. Oh, I didn't actually want to do that. Okay, it didn't do anything. As you can see here, I'm calling enter SU URL. The test is very clean. All it does is do some validation and that kind of thing. It doesn't have to set up the dashboard. It doesn't have to set up the web server. It doesn't have to do any of that kind of stuff. And the reason you can get away with that with universal dashboard is because it's like I'm building this website every single time. And that is accomplished by using this driver. So this driver here actually will find the test files. It'll set up the entire dashboard and start the browser and that kind of thing once. It only does that once because it takes anywhere between 5 and 15 seconds to start and stop the browser. So that's a huge amount of time that you waste when running tests. And I lost my train of thought. I don't know what I was going to say. But yeah, so that that saves tons of time. Oh, I know. The reason this works is we also have a dashboard that has every single component on the dashboard and in multiple different configurations for that component. So you can see that each one of the components is like set up on this page so that we can validate each one of the components. So this is something that you typically will not I guess be privy to if you are testing a web app, because you're not going to be just testing components, that kind of thing. And you can see here that we just configure each one of these components and run through a suite of tests. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually run this driver script, and this is going to hopefully run the test suite. And what you'll see is it'll pop open the dashboard. And it's going to just start navigating between the different pages and invoking my tests. So you can see there's the app bar page. It's testing various things. It's clicking on stuff, autocomplete page, avatar page. So I actually have a couple failing pages in here, and you'll see what happens when the entire page doesn't work. But you can see this is a lot faster than starting the web browser every single time. So you can see here the chips page is not working. And because of that, none of these tests are gonna pass. And there is an implicit weight that is looking for each one of these elements. You can see that my implicit weight currently right now is set to 10 seconds. So it's really funny because like I need to improve these tests even further, because anytime I know the tests fail when I see the universal dashboard build run like 10 times as long, because really we should do some validation up front to validate that the page itself is there at all. Yeah, and then kind of go from there. So I had this high aspirations of like making each test self-sufficient, but I think it's more likely that you should maybe do some validation up front for your particular scripts. So this is just going to continue to just run through these, and we'll eventually get to the end. So I think I actually have another page that fails, but so yeah, that's a big section or example of our test suite for Universal Dashboard. So it's actually cool to actually see it run so quickly, and it's always really fun to watch it just kind of go through a website like this and validate this stuff. Yeah. So that that is pretty much what I wanted to demo in terms of showing off how this is integrated with Universal Dashboard, how we integrate it with Pester, and I've kind of gone through like the basics of the Selenium module. There's more that you can do with the Selenium module, and we're always looking for contributors on the Selenium module. So definitely pop over to GitHub. I can pop that open again. I also noticed that there's a couple of pull requests sitting open there that I need to check out. But yeah, the Selenium module is here. And there's a bunch of like functionality that we haven't wrapped yet in PowerShell command, so it'd be cool to get some of that. And then some of the other problems are like updating the WebDriver so they're the most recent versions and that kind of thing. So And I see a question. Yes, questions. Question, does the PowerShell Selenium automation work with PowerShell Core and Linux? Yes, it does. So it is cross-platform. We had a contributor come in and clean that up and make it so that it works cross-platform. Any other questions? What does this link do?
Yeah, we got a couple questions on the. Oh, it looks like you actually.
Yeah, can I just pull this up? That's cool. Can you find elements by selector? Yes. Oh, with module Selenium, you can find. Let me think about that. You definitely can find them by CSS Selector. I don't know if it's in the module. I think it is, though. I think you can find stuff in CSS Selector. How does Selenium handle web page auth? Because it's just using the browser, like all your cookies and that kind of thing are saved. So there's nothing really stopping you from like authing with a website. I've like automated some of the universal dashboard authentication testing where we actually log into Azure AD and that kind of thing. It's just storing all those cookies. There are settings for like clearing your profile and that kind of thing, or setting a profile when the browser loads up. So there's a bunch of different settings per browser that you can actually configure when starting the driver itself. So Selenium is not a way of making a web GUI. That was Universal Dashboard was making the GUI, and we were just automating the interaction with that GUI via Selenium. So Selenium was just the part that was actually like interacting with that GUI. Would I rather find one horse-sized duck? I think I'd rather have 100 duck-sized horses. I feel like I could just kick them. And then there was a question about the Selenium ID and clean code. What I've found with the Selenium ID, but I haven't played with this in years. I mean, like probably like 10 years, but it was always like very fragile. So you would record things and then those things would change. And you'd have to like go back and clean up stuff and that kind of thing. Done much combination between Selenium Pester. So aside from what I showed with the universal dashboard tests, that's pretty much the kind of extent I've taken Selenium and Pester. So more or less I'm using Selenium in Pester tests and using just standard syntax of each of the modules, but there's no like actual integration there. We could probably add some cool Pester like extensions or something like that, like should support for Selenium, but that is not there right now. Where can you learn more about Selenium if they know nothing about it? So the Selenium documentation is really good, but the Selenium module itself is not like an officially supported thing for Selenium. So it's going to be a little, not one-to-one kind of thing. I do have a blog post on like the Ironman software blog that has like a bunch of different examples of different things that you can do in Selenium. So just if you search like Selenium PowerShell, it's one of the first things that pops up on Google. So check that out. That will give you like a bunch of examples of what you can do with the Selenium PowerShell stuff. And then how far down the web testing rabbit hole do you think you are? So I think I am on the surface of it because I'm not actually testing like I am testing websites that I'm creating dynamically myself kind of thing. So I'm testing a web framework rather than testing an actual live website. So I have the benefit of being able to manipulate that website as I see fit. So I think that there are probably aspects of web testing that I am not hitting because of that, because I can kind of like, oh, I need an ID there. It's way easier to find that. But in certain websites, it might be very hard to find elements. Elements might change, that kind of thing. So I still think that there's probably some room for improvement in the module and just in terms of like the skills that I've acquired doing this. So, and I think if there's no more questions, we're going to give away a license. 1 second. I need to get this script back. Let me see if I can. 1 second. I gotta. Oh, 1 second. I'm coming back. All right. Get my. All right. This. All right, cool. All right, so this will actually get a random person from the viewers via the API. And bloop. All right. I don't know how to pronounce this. Denver01. Yeah, if you hit me up on Twitter or something like that, or find some way to contact me. And yeah, you. I will hook you up. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out later. I'm very accessible usually in terms of Selenium. If you have questions on Universal Dashboard or anything that I talked about today, just let me know. And I appreciate you guys having me on here. Oh, and I saw John Waltz ask about Austin. He's good. He just got back from a walk. And anytime, happy to do this.